Willkommen, willkommen. You are listening to Zeitgeist, the podcast with me, Katja Heuer, your host, historian, journalist, and all-purpose Anglo-German. On this show, I regularly welcome guests who have interesting things to say about Germany's past, present, and future. Today, I'm delighted to speak with Stephan Malinowski, who is a renowned historian in Germany and well beyond, focusing on the role of German nobility in Nazi Germany. He was born in Berlin in 1966 and has studied history and taught history in Germany, France, Italy, the United States, and Ireland. He is currently Professor of Modern European History at the University of Edinburgh and also the author of Nazis and Nobles, The History of a Misalliance. Today, Professor Malinowski is here to talk about his latest book, The Hohenzollerns and the Nazis, A History of Collaboration, which will be out in the UK on the 30th of January 2025. It has casually been described to me by his publisher as incendiary, and indeed it sparked a very lively debate when it came out in Germany, mostly around the role of the dynasty of the German Kaisers, the Hohenzollerns, in the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. It also won the very prestigious German Book Prize for non-fiction. I should say at this point that this has still got very real legal implications. The House of Hohenzollern has launched various legal proceedings against Professor Malinowski in the past, but we will get to this a little bit later in the program. For now, welcome to Zeitgeist, Professor Malinowski.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation.
Well, let's start by setting the scene for our listeners, some of whom may not be familiar with the historical context of your work. In just a few sentences, can you explain who the Hohenzollerns were or who they still are?
Well, the very short answer would be that the Hohenzollerns were one of the most important families of the German high nobility. The longer answer would be the House of Hohenzollern was an important German dynasty whose members were variously princes and electors and kings and emperors in various parts of Germany. And most importantly, between 1871 and 1918, they provided the emperors of the German Kaiserreich, of the German Empire. And my book basically looks at the history of that family, who, by the way, originally came from the south of Germany. But it's a long time ago when it was mentioned first time, I think, in the 13th century. Sorry, in the 11th century. My book basically looks at the history of that family between 1918 and 1945, but with some larger glimpses leading up to our own present.
And you just mentioned that they were basically the only ruling family that ruled over all of Germany as a nation state from 1871 to 1918. And that rule as German emperors came to a rather ignominious end in 1918 when Kaiser Wilhelm and his son, the Crown Prince Wilhelm, were forced to renounce their claims to the German throne and go into exile. And then Germany became a republic and reinvented itself as a liberal democracy, the so-called Weimar Republic. Did this mean that the Hohenzollerns were indeed out of power, as that move undoubtedly intended, or did they retain some form of a sort of public influence in Germany in the interwar period?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd say again, the short answer is politically and technically the answer is yes, it was. It was a complete downfall and it was a complete loss of their power. Now, there are, of course, historical comparisons to make. You could compare it to the downfall of the French monarchy in the French Revolution and the killing of the French King Louis XVI in January 1793, or closer to the Hohenzollerns, of course. And this is the example that everybody is looking at the time. The Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and the murder of the Romanov family, of the Tsarist family in summer 1918 in Yekaterinburg. These were the standards against which the events in Germany were measured. By that standards, the Hohenzollerns kept some power and fared quite well. Now, by the standards of the time itself, still we have to say it's a very, very deep fall from a very high position to very, very deep. Germany being dismantled, all the German monarchies falling apart basically overnight. The Kaiser and his son fleeing to Dutch exile overnight, the institutions disappearing in Germany, being left as a completely destroyed and shattered country in November 1918. Now, institutions like, I would say, this is a somehow longer and more complicated and winded answer. Institutions like monarchies or nation states or classes or religions and their institutions have a tendency to outlast their formal abolition. And this holds true for the German nobility after 1918, which is still existing. So they do not lose their heads, they do not lose their castles, they do not lose their assets, and they do not even lose their titles, which is quite important during the Weimar Republic. So they are still there, and there are still some millions of Germans feeling close to, in whatever vague way, to the ideas of monarchy, to the king, to the Kaiser. And I think what is important to keep in mind, these are extremely dire, unstable, and insecure times in Germany in 1920s and 30s, particularly if we compare them to the British circumstances, where basically Britain remains what it was before 1914, at least in a formal way, looking at the institutions, the monarchy, the political system. And then monarchy, like in all countries in Europe, and probably also beyond Europe, monarchies represent steadiness, stability, tradition. It presents a frame, it presents order, it presents orientation. So this is what many Germans mean. I'm speaking of millions of Germans are missing. And in that sense, the power which remained was a more of a symbolic order in the background. There was still this family. And again, my example with the Russian Revolution, where the Tsar was no longer there and his family was no longer there. So there was not really a going back in the Russian context, but there was a possible going back in time and to the so-called gute alte Zeit, the good old times, that was theoretically possible in the German context. And this is where I would see the remaining power and influence of the family, of its institutions, and of all the symbolic stuff that was representing in the 20s and 30s.
And that's I always find is really interesting when you study the Weimar Republic, because that spirit, I think, really comes through just how many people longed for some sort of restoration of the monarchy. So there were monarchist political parties who outright had this as part of their manifesto. I mean, they operated in a republic, as a legal political party, basically with the intent of destroying that republic and bringing the monarchy back. And then, as you just said, you had people who spoke about the good old days when we still had the Kaiser, kind of, having a kind of glowing recollection of what things were like before 1914. Kaiser Wilhelm's second wife, Hermine, is still referred to as the Kaiserin or the Empress, despite the fact that she married Wilhelm 4 years after his abdication in exile. There's President Hindenburg, who gets elected into office in 1925 and is often referred to as the Ersatzkaiser, kind of, as you say, like a form of kind of bringing some of that stuff back that people longed for. So how widespread was this sort of sentiment? Would you say that's mainstream, or is it kind of just particular groups? And isn't it in some ways in stark contrast to the idea that Germans hounded the Kaiser out of Germany in 1918?
Well, that's debatable if they really hounded him out of Germany as he's leaving overnight the frontier, which, by the way, doesn't go down well with parts of the particularly Prussian military nobility. And there were actually plans, or at least ideas, the Kaiser should have, in a last heroic attack, sacrificed his own life, and perhaps together with the crown prince, and deliberately looking for his own death on the battlefield in order to leave some kind of a legacy for the German monarchy. This is exactly what he's not doing. So this form of a flight, or monarchists call it the Abreise, the departure, as if he had taken a suitcase and gone for a vacation, which is not really the case. So the man is leaving the country. And it is very difficult to measure how widespread this nostalgia was. I think what is important for the entire Weimar Republic context is a combination of a widespread nostalgia for the past and a disdain or hatred against the existing republic, which is seen by many people as weak, as decadent, as going nowhere, as un-German. This is, of course, more widespread in the circles and in the milieu of the German right of all brands and colors. So, of course, communists and socialists feel very little enthusiasm for the German monarchy, but many others do. And well, I was born in West Berlin, and my own grandmother, who was working class background from Berlin, Kreuzberg, she always told me about the Kaiser. The lady died in her 1990s, and she was a sworn social democrat, and she came from a social democrat, socialist family in like 3 or 4 generations back. But all of these people had a certain nostalgia for, this is when she was young, she was born in 1900. And I think this is quite, I mean, it's only one example, but I think it stands for millions of examples of a very vague form of sympathy and nostalgia for the better days that were represented by the Hohenzollern. And perhaps when we look at the German right, we tend to forget that Hitler, it takes him like 10 or 12 years in order to craft him into what we know as the Führer. If you look at 1923, this is the year when the Crown Prince comes back to Germany from his Dutch exile. He's exiled on a Dutch island for between 18 and 23. It was a ridiculous idea that this man, Hitler, who by then is a stateless man coming out of the social nowhere, speaking with an Austrian accent and having a weird mustache, a weird haircut, being badly dressed and slurping his soup in a restaurant. No one would see him as, whereas the Crown Prince coming back as the former commander of the largest German army group. And he is born into a family. He is meant to be the mightiest man of the planet had Germany won the war. Yeah, so the idea that no one knows, this is the point I'm trying to make, let's say in the 1920s, who out of this amoeba of a yet unformed extreme right is going to be the leader. So it was not yet the Nazis. The Nazis take up to 1930 to be the party that we know it later was, or up to 1932, we could say. So the idea that this Crown Prince coming back and that the family, he's not alone, he has brothers and they're all somehow, he has one younger brother who enters the Nazi party and who rises to general rank in the SA. And all the other family members are more or less clearly linked to the German right. And the possibility, the likelihood that this family was going to play an important role politically was not at all absurd when read from the 1920s. It is later absurd when you read it from inside the Third Reich, but in this formative phase, it is not.
Yeah, which probably explains, and we'll get to that in a minute, why the Hohenzollerns themselves had some hopes that they might be involved in any sort of future government that abolishes the Republic. You already mentioned the Crown Prince, Wilhelm, a few times, because he really is the key figure here when we're talking about the sort of linchpin between the Nazis and the Hohenzollerns. Can you paint us a bit of a picture of the man? What was he like?
I think a word would come to my mind is that he's a very, very modern figure in the way that he played with the media. And I mean, he's born into this Prussian tradition and also formed not as a man of culture, but as a man of military. And at least formally, he is the commander of the largest German army group in 1918. Practically, he isn't. He doesn't have the qualification to do it, but symbolically, he is. By the time he comes back into this newly formed Germany in 1923, he changes the image. He's still often wandering around in uniforms and in fantasy uniforms. He later becomes member of the so-called Stahlhelm, which is a military organization of the German conservatives. He lives in a small castle near to Potsdam at Sizilienhof, but he has another Renaissance castle in Silesia, in Oels. This is like 380 kilometers east of Berlin. So there are various spots and points where he is hunting and talking and inviting people. He is, well, he was born to the utmost echelons of the German society. He is a lover of, this is what he is famous or unfamous for, depending on where you look, from where you look at it, as a lover of spectacularly beautiful women who change all the time and they're actresses, etc. He's famous for having a lot of affairs. though he is, of course, married and a family man. The crown princess is living with him in Potsdam, and the children. He's a man of hunting trips, of soirees, of light opera, of clubs, of cocktails, of dinner parties, of theaters, of galas, of tennis courts. He's a sportsman. He's a boxer. He appears on the Kurfürstendamm in Berlin, where he's driving around in fancy sports cars. He is constantly smoking cigarettes. If you look at the photos and if you read the descriptions of the time, one could think of a nouveau riche, of an industrialist's son, or of a daddy's boy, of an aristocratic jerk who tossed cigarettes to soldiers from his bright red car while keeping himself safely behind the front lines. These are anecdotes during the war. So he's a very, like a chameleon. He is able to change his color and his form and his appearance depending on who he talks to. And he is volksnah, as you would say in Germany, which means close to the people, or at least pretending to be close to the people. He is someone who would stop and talk to a fisherman or to a worker. It doesn't mean that he is really close to it, but he has this capacity of how to say that, how to play different roles. This is why I call him modern. He's just not the pretender. I mean, he theoretically, in the legitimist way, he is the pretender to the German throne. But at the same time, he is more corresponding to a modern Führer figure. And this is an interesting contrast, of course, to Hitler, who is an aesthetic, and he was very aesthetic. He was a bachelor, who was a non-smoker, who was a tea, who doesn't drink alcohol, who is a vegetarian, who doesn't sing, who doesn't dance, who doesn't do any sports, etc. So he's a very lively figure, and I think there's a certain sympathy that he's collecting in the German public. In a very short English word, he's an interesting man.
He reminds, I mean, even with the characteristics that you just described, he does indeed remind one of several modern figures who aren't really close to the people, but are very good at capturing that sort of spirit, you know, talking to ordinary people, despite the fact that they're fabulously sort of rich themselves, but somehow they still speak to your ordinary worker or you know, people out on the streets. So as you just said, there's quite a big contrast between him, you know, and Hitler as a figure, you know, the sort of soup slurping lower middle class Austrian who seems from an entirely different world, really. And somehow that connection between them starts to develop. Can you give us a bit of an insight? How does this start, or how and when does this start to happen, that there's a connection between the Crown Prince and the emerging Nazi movement?
Well, that starts out in the late 1920s, but there are earlier connections, and then of course there are bridges, there are figures building bridges between the Nazi milieu and the milieu of the Hohenzollerns, or in a wider sense, the connection between the Nazis and the milieu of the German high nobility, which is very far from being natural. And these are really two very extremely different worlds and milieus. One of the leading, or one of the most important figures, is Hermann Göring. And Göring, who knew the Crown Prince from war times, and they were comrades, if you will. So Göring is, by the way, in the entire German context, one of the most important bridge builders between noblemen and the Nazi party. Also because Göring's second son is an aristocrat from Scandinavia, and Göring had these personal kind of forms of connections. So there are personal ways of coming together and of agreeing about certain things. There is one moment, so this is already in March 1932, at the moment of the second round of the presidential elections. And there is a moment in the second half of March 1932. The Crown Prince is lying in his bed in his Renaissance castle in Silesia with a lumbago, and he cannot get up. And there are some emissaries coming to him and suggesting to him a plan which foresees that the Crown Prince should be the collective candidate of the entire German right and stand against the communist Ernst Thälmann. This would have worked if Hindenburg would have withdrawn his candidature, and Hitler as well. What is interesting in this short, very weird moment in German history is that Hitler agrees to it. So there's a plan in 1932 according to which the crown prince would become the president of the republic and Hitler would become his Reichschancellor. And the power would be split between the crown prince and the Nazis. And there's an agreement on this. This fails because the Kaiser, who's still living in exile, vetoes this and even writes to his son, I'm going to throw you out of the family. You're going to be disinherited, my son. You should take some time off in Italy, and you are too stupid in order to understand politics. And weirdly or not weirdly enough, this man who was already in his 50s by that moment accepts his father's veto. But I'm telling this story or this anecdote because it demonstrates what actually was planned. It does not materialize, but there is for a long time, there are various different plans of how can we share the power to overcome the republic and to smash the left and the power of the socialists by sharing the power between the conservatives and the Nazis, which, by the way, is more or less what is happening in 1933, but without the Hohenzollern and without the crown prince. Perhaps to understand this, it's not so much that they share the same aims, and it's not that the crown prince was a Nazi. He was not a Nazi, never was a Nazi. The Kaiser was not a Nazi. By the way, looking at this topic makes you think, what actually do we mean when we say person X or Y is a Nazi? Does it mean someone becomes a party member, or what exactly does it mean? He does not become a party member. So apart from the Kaiser's second wife, Princess Hermine, that you had already mentioned, and the younger brother, August Wilhelm, who actually, I would call them Nazis. And still there, I would have doubts. The importance is not that they share the same goals. The importance is that they hate the same things. And this, by the way, goes for the entire Prussian nobility and for larger parts of the German nobility. What they share with the Nazis, they are anti-communist. So you have to explain it by the antis. They're anti-communist, they're anti-socialist. They are anti-democratic, they are anti-parliament, they're anti-Semitic, they're anti-union, they are anti-urban. This goes less for the crown prince, but in the sense that the nobility and the Nazis have this kind of being rooted in the soil and creating a newly formed empire, which was not going to be the one of the clubs and nightclubs of Berlin, but something that would go back to German traditions and soil. This is somehow, this is the speech, this is a language of the German nobility, if you will. And there is a shared disdain or hatred of Weimar culture, of modern literature, modern theater, etc. So if you put these antis together, you have somehow the matrix out of which this collaboration comes from. And it is, I think, important to understand it is not to say that these people were becoming 100% Nazis. They were acting in this gray zone in which the collaboration between the Nazis and the conservative right-wing non-Nazi milieu is operating.
Yeah, and let's stick with that term collaboration for a moment, because I think we can already tell by the way that you're very careful in how you phrase this, the exact nature of the collaboration between the Nazis and the Hohenzollerns. Was it ideological? Was it power-based? Was it based on the antis? You're doing this for a good reason, namely that there are some very real implications for the Hohenzollern family today, and for Germany by extension today in this. Maybe can you explain that briefly? So how is this, before we go back to the history, how is this still relevant today, what the exact nature of the collaboration between the Nazis and the Hohenzollerns was at the time in the 1930s?
Mm-hmm. Perhaps for the title and the term collaboration, I picked this with a lot of thinking about it before. Actually, in history, collaboration or collaboration coming from a French context in 1940, when the head of the French state in 1940, after the French defeat, shakes hands with Hitler. And collaboration in the French context does not mean that the defeated Frenchmen are all becoming Nazis and like the Germans. Very, very far from it. It's an asymmetrical form of collaborating with someone who is more powerful because you think that you might have advantages yourself later. In the case of the Hohenzollern, it basically meant collaborating with the Nazis might mean that one day we were able to gain some kind of power position or even the throne back. Now the question became in Germany, the question if or if not they collaborated became legally sensitive in Germany right after German unification in the early 1990s. as for thousands of family, thousands of family in Germany, the Hohenzollerns had been disinherited by the Soviets right after 45. So this is the starting point. The Soviets are disinheriting the Hohenzollerns in 1945. In the 1990s then, so this is right after the German reunification, there was the legal possibility for the expropriated families to claim compensation for the expropriations. And however, the relevant law of 1994, and this is the legal point, excluded compensation if the last owner had significantly supported either the Nazi regime or the communist GDR. And this question, that is whether the last crown prince had significantly supported the Nazi National Socialism, was the subject of proceedings that lasted for, I think, 2 decades. The Hohenzollerns had paid various renowned historians to write expert opinions. The federal state of Brandenburg had requested 2 counter opinions, out of which one was written by myself. This was in 2014. So this was, if you will, the beginning of me looking at the Hohenzollerns. I was asked, okay, could you please write an expert opinion about how the crown prince was acting? In this context, the Hohenzollerns had also taken legal action against newspapers, against various major German broadcasters, against journalists, authors, and against some historians, out of which I was one of them. In over 80 written warnings or cease and desist letters, attempts were made by the Hohenzollern family to ban certain individual statements that Hohenzollern considered inaccurate. And then, and this is for the time being the end of the story, in March 23, the so-called head of the house, so the now head of the house of the Hohenzollern family, publicly stated that the family was waiving the very compensation claims that were linked to this Nazi question, and also the ongoing lawsuits regarding media law issues were then withdrawn. This was last year in March 23. But this is a very unusual thing, I think, in history, that you have a mixture of German courts being implicated and lawyers and judges being meant to judge about a historical question. And that at the same time, you have a kind of the Hohenzollern family firing out legal proceedings and attacks against historians, journalists, and the great newspapers of the country. So this was going on for like 2 years.
Yeah, and there was a lot at stake as well. I mean, not just the actual physical goods, like, you know, the palaces, the things that are in museums, pieces of art and things like that, as in who they actually belong to, the Hohenzollerns or the state, and should they be publicly available. But it's also just the fundamental questions that Germany suddenly had to ask itself again, you know, what is its relationship to this former ruling family, which was kind of declared dead really as a political entity, you know, for decades. So I found that really interesting, watching all of that unfold in Germany, suddenly having to face questions of pre-1945 history again that had kind of, you know, evolved to a very fragile consensus, I think, before then. So what was your answer to that question? Was Crown Prince Wilhelm sort of significantly involved in furthering the Nazi system?
Yeah, my answer was a clear yes. And I mean, I do remember that the first day when I first went to to one of the relevant archives in Potsdam, because they said to me, listen, we have a documentation here, but you not at least, because I was very reluctant to look into it at the beginning. I didn't want to go back to this topic, which was the topic of my own PhD 20 years before. So I went there, and I remember that after an hour, I had the impression that the answer was very, very, very clear. And I was astonished. I mean, even as an historian who had been looking at the Prussian nobility for 20 years, I was astonished by how clear everything seemed to me, that this kind of support by the Crown Prince himself, but also by certain statements of the Kaiser in exile and of other family members, was absolutely clear to me. Not all historians see it this way. It's very difficult. We cannot really measure like in a laboratory the degree of support that an individual gives to a certain political group. The lawyers, and this was an interesting constellation for me, the lawyers, the judges wanted a clear answer, so yes and no. And this is how lawyers do work, and they have to work. We as historians cannot really work this. We come up with a nuanced answer and say, yes, but it's more complicated. Or we would say, yes, actually, very clearly we can see how and why this man was hoping that some kind of collaboration with the Nazis would be helpful for him. Now, measuring if this had 5% importance or 10% importance or 60% importance is simply not doable by the tools that we have as historians. I would say that today, 80 to 90% of the historians who have been looking into it would somehow agree on my own answer, but there are some colleagues who still see this differently. In retrospect, and I believe that historians, including myself, have allowed themselves to be lured too far onto the slippery slope of legal question. That is to say, they have tried to answer the question of the effect of the crown prince with a simple yes or no. And I think it's also boring, and it does not correspond to reality. If you ask me, if we take out Hermann Göring or if we take out Goebbels out of the equation, would the Third Reich still exist? My answer would be yes. Of course, you can take out one single person, but I always thought it was quite a ridiculous idea that a fallen German crown prince living in Potsdam and acting within the milieu of the German right in this extremely, in this witch's cauldron of political ideologies and instability would have been without any impact in the right-wing milieu. I mean, how could, I would not even, I still find it very difficult to even understand how this could be argued. Though, of course, everybody who looks at the thing more than 5 minutes would agree, yes, we cannot measure. Actually, the answer that the lawyers want from us is very difficult, if not impossible, to give.
Yeah, I guess that term of substantially or significantly furthering, that tries to kind of suggest that there are degrees of things, but it's still a yes or a no answer, really, what people want from you and other historians. I found it quite interesting, when the debate was unfolding, and as you say, there were several historians sort of giving their judgments, that some of them still stuck to the sort of idea that Wilhelm was more of a useful idiot, really, to the Nazis than a useful helper as such, or somebody who was necessary for them to come into power. And this, I think, was triggered by the fact that the Nazis later on sort of turned their backs on the Hohenzollerns to a large extent and didn't really sort of need or appreciated the help of the crown prince as much as he was almost willing to give it. So, why did the Nazis not drive a more conciliatory course towards the German nobility? So when you look at Italy, which maybe serves as a sort of comparison there, where Benito Mussolini, sort of works more closely in conjunction with the aristocratic regime, not least, of course, with the king. And it seems that many German nobles would have happily colluded, according to some of the sort of source base that we've got, in destroying democracy. So where did that divergence on ideology come about, and why did it come about, and why did Hitler not make more use of the German nobility's willingness to help him?
Perhaps first a remark to this term useful idiot, which, by the way, was used by myself and also by some colleagues I had been working with, Carina Urbach, for example. The term useful idiot sometimes is attributed to Lenin. And actually, yes, it's a very good form, but then it has two different parts. The formula, first, he was not a particularly intelligent man, and he was not a brilliant or an excellent political analyst. He was not a man with great intellectual capacity, which is true. But then in the end, he was indeed useful for the Nazis. So yes, a useful idiot might, if we like the term, it might work. There's this mixture of an overestimation of himself and an underestimation of the Nazis, which, by the way, again, is characteristic for the entire milieu of the Prussian nobility. This is the typical standpoint they have. And they have it, up to 1933. And I think for the crown prince, for his father, for other members of the family, and for other members of the German elite, bourgeoisie or nobility or other, this is the attitude that it takes them years and years to overcome, to see that the relationship between rider and horse that they imagine is reversed, and that they are the horse and not the rider. And they are not going to outplay the Nazis, but they're outplayed by the Nazis very quickly. So we can call it a useful idiot. Within this debate, I have never understood why and how those who had sympathies for the Hohenzollern and the family and for the idea of the German Restoration also insisted so much on the Crown Prince being a complete idiot, and that the entire family that was presented as having no importance at all. It still strikes me as a very weird constellation that those who have the sympathies for the family and for the traditions at Stanford explained to us it had no importance at all, and its members were idiots. Well, I think it's a bit more complicated. As for the conciliatory course that the Nazis could have taken towards the monarchy, I would say they did, because they never attack. I mean, the Nazis, before coming to power and being in power, they never attack the family. They do not disinherit the family. They do not force them into exile. They are just, at a certain moment, they are no longer useful. And I think you can study this when looking at Hitler, and we know this from the excellent biographies we have about him, but also about other parts of the Nazi elite. There is a time when they think we need the Hohenzollern and they are important. And we know that 1932, Hitler still thinks that in a direct election, in a presidential election against the Crown Prince, he would lose. And where still they consider the Hohenzollern, meaning the traditional conservative elites, are a power we have to deal with. And they mean the lawyers, they mean the high civil servants. Most importantly, they mean the Reichswehr, they mean the army, and they represent the power of. So we have to somehow make a deal with these people. Then it goes very, very quickly after 1933. I would say it takes perhaps the first 6 months, or you could extend it to the so-called Night of the Long Knives, which is the murder of the SA in summer 1934. So if you count it largely, then perhaps 1.5 years and the Hohenzollern are out. They do no longer need them. But at the beginning, so it depends on where we look from it. If you look at it from 1930, they're still there. After 34, 35, 36 and onwards, they're no longer needed for anything. And I think Hitler, to his own surprise, and the Nazis, to their own surprise, we can make it without them. We don't need them. And even the Reichswehr leadership is basically following our aims. We don't need them anymore. And this goes for the former leading generals and higher officers who had been Kaisertreu, who had been working with and for the Kaiser, or many of them shift into the Nazi camp. As you were asking for the model of Italian fascism, one important thing, the Kaiser in exile and his son, the Crown Prince, they are enthusiastic about the Italian model. And this is, of course, what they dream of. They see it is possible to combine a monarch and a fascist leader, as it is in power in Italy since 1922. So early on the day, there is a functioning, existing model, which, by the way, everywhere in Europe for the extreme right, is attractive. The Crown Prince is traveling several times to Rome. He meets Mussolini and he presents his sons, etc., etc. And he's absolutely enthusiastic and telling his father, the Kaiser in exile, listen, this is the model to go. This is what we have to go for. Perhaps where the lines of resistance, I wouldn't call it resistance, but where there's limits to this collaboration. If you read it from the side of the Prussian nobility and of the Hohenzollern, there are two parts. The first, and I think most important thing, is the socialist sound of Nazi propaganda. So the Nazis in their earlier days had what some historians call a left wing. I don't think it was ever a left wing, but there is a socialist parlance and jargon in the words and the wording and the propaganda, especially in the SA. And it's unclear to the German elites, what are these thugs that are raging through our streets and terrorizing every city, every village, and every street? What exactly are they going to do to us once that they are in power? What is the SA doing if they are going to override the traditional army? The SA in 1933 comprises some 500,000 men. The Reichswehr has only 100,000. So how is this power play going to be played out later? This is one thing, the sound of socialist, and the question of, will they touch upon our real estates, on our great large estates? Most of the Hohenzollern family as well, but this goes for the entire nobility, these people still having estates, and it is unclear if the Nazis are going to disinherit it or to break these estates apart. That's one thing. And the second part is about the fascist style and the brutality in the streets, which goes too far to certain people. So they are members of the nobility, they're members of the bourgeoisie who are afraid of this kind of power unleashed and uncontrolled by the Nazis, where no one really knows where this is going to lead to. But this form of resistance does not apply to the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince himself is openly supporting the SA, and he is openly supporting an alliance between the Stahlhelm, so this is the military organization of the conservatives, and the SA. He is publicly, and I think this is one of his most important contributions to the making of the Third Reich, he is actively proclaiming and cheering for the merger of these two organizations and to the collaboration with the SA. And he is writing a letter to the then acting Minister of Defense in 1932, saying we should put some communists on the asphalt, and we shouldn't be that careful with our political enemies, and we should be harder and we should be more brutal. And he openly admires the brutality of the fascist style in Italy.
And you already alluded to the fact that, of course, Crown Prince Wilhelm isn't the only member of the nobility with any sort of opinion on this. Are there any redeeming examples, or did the majority of the German nobility tacitly approve National Socialism until it no longer needed them?
Redeeming is a good word. Yes, there are redeeming examples, I think. I was really astonished not to find any redeeming example in the family itself, because it's a large family. And when I started writing the book, everybody said, Stephan, you have to find at least one bright person and someone who stood against the Nazi regime. I did not really manage to find one. And even this is the second son of the Crown Prince, Louis Ferdinand, who is the most sympathetic and shiny, impressive figure as a man. And who was supposed to have been close to what the German resistance later becomes. It's not. It might have been the case in 44, 45 by the very end, but in 1933 we have a documentation where he himself also is supporting Hitler and the regime and says this is the way forward, this is the future, and acting with the Nazis is the future. So within the family, I could not find redeeming examples, but of course the history of the Prussian nobility is different and more nuanced, and there were families and family members who from the beginning on stood openly against the Nazis. Interestingly enough, this is more the case in the Catholic families of the German nobility, most of all in Bavaria and in the southwest of the country. It is much less the case in the militarily oriented families, the warrior tribes, as a colleague of mine calls them, the warrior tribes of the Prussian nobility, where the aim is rebuilding the army, revenge for 1918, and preparing for the next war. And for that, the Nazis seem to offer the program. And of course, we do have the failing bomb plot of the 20th of July, 1944, with the main leading figure of Count Stauffenberg, but who again is from a southern German and Catholic family and has very little to do. But there is a lot of Prussian noblemen implied there. And I spent a lot of energy and time in order to figure out if or if not members of the Hohenzollern family were implicated in this bomb plot. My answer is not, at least not if we look what they actively did. And we have a documentation, but this is known since the 1950s, that the Crown Prince actively advised his son not to take any action in the bomb plot in 44 or in this conjuration. So we're not directly implied, but it's if we go to counterfactual history, and I think this is a very important, a very interesting question, though, of course, like with all counterfactual history, we don't have answers, but to ask what would have happened if the crown prince and if the Kaiser in exile, or if perhaps the entire family had issued some kind of proclamation against the Nazis. And this could have happened in 32 or in 33, or they could have gone to exile, or they could have supported the conservative resistance as it existed from 1940-42 on. And the answer is they didn't. And this is a kind of, I think for me, this is the most important question in this entire story, because it says something about the lack of a conservative counterpart to the Nazis. In all other countries, in Europe or in most other countries, and by the way, including in Britain, we had in the 1920s and 30s forces and political players who were conservative, yes, anti-democrats perhaps, yes, and anti-socialist and anti-communist, of course, but not Nazi. And what is lacking in this specific situation of 32, 33 is a powerful conservative counterpart, because if I may add this and remind us that 1933, the so-called seizure of power, is a transfer of power and is a coalition between Nazis and conservatives. And there is no a German conservative counterpart to the Nazis, I think, would have needed the Hohenzollerns and would have needed the Prussian tradition of conservatism. So what I see in this story, and this is actually what I feel is the center, not only of my book, but of this entire story, is the self-destruction of German conservatism, and is the self-betrayal of German conservatism and its own ideals, which is partly operated or at least represented by this family. And this is, if you want to use this word, a Greek word, the tragedy is the downfall and the self-destruction of the German conservatives.
And just sort of as a last question, let's have a quick look at how this was seen throughout history. This these kind of big trends that you just outlined. Because after the war, obviously you get two Germanys, an East and a West German states from 1949 onwards, and they do take very different approaches when it came to kind of judging the role of the nobility and their position in Nazi Germany. So in the East, and I'm simplifying here, but in the East you get a sort of blanket accusation of collaboration, saying kind of you were in the nobility, ergo you were at least in part responsible for what happened. Hence they justified the disinheriting of the noble families after 1949. And even before that in the Soviet occupation zone. And in the West, you get the Stauffenberg plot that you mentioned earlier of 1944 to assassinate Hitler, almost as a way of exonerating the German nobility, where there's basically this sort of idea that they weren't really implied with this. And then once they realized just how bad Nazism is, or was, they kind of turned against the Nazis. So these are very different ideas. Has the reunified German state since 1990, through your work and that of other historians, reached some sort of consensus on the role of the Hohenzollerns and the German nobility more widely in Nazism, or does this debate still rage on, even if the family is now sort of for the time being waived their claims to their goods and to their palaces and to their inheritance?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that if we look at the Hohenzollerns as being just a smaller part and piece in the puzzle of German history, and particularly the history of the German Kaiserreich and what this time means, then we don't yet have an answer. And I think that the great two narratives that stood against each other, that is the historical narrative of West Germany against East Germany, and this communist interpretation of history, and particularly also of the monarchy and the nobility. I mean, when the Russians rush through Eastern Prussia and take the eastern parts of Germany in 44, 45, they're basically destroying every castle that they can see, and they destroy it stone by stone and brick by brick, because in their interpretation, the noble families were one of the most important cornerstones of this regime of the Third Reich. They don't see the ambivalences that there were in this relation between the Nazis and the nobility. They hate them, they destroy them, they have a very clear-cut picture. And I think this goes for the GDR as well. I think that many people who lived in the GDR, who had a skeptical or negative view of their own government, and who looked for counter traditions and political counter images, if you will, not necessarily the Kaiser, but perhaps, as I said about my own grandmother, who was not GDR, but who was a socialist and who somehow thought back to the good old times in whatever, when she saw 1912 unter den Linden in Berlin, the Kaiser riding on his wonderful horses, etc. This was one of, I think, the most important political memory this woman had. And so, yes, I think that strangely or not strangely enough, there is a vague of positive, nostalgic elements in the GDR way of remembering this time. And I don't think that after that, since reunification, we already have a combination of these two narratives. I think that they are still standing against each other, or are still trying to find a combination that perhaps we take another generation or even two in order to have one. I like this metaphor about British history, where British history is like a fireplace to warm your hands when it gets cold in your own present. At least this is how many British people like to see their own past and history. This metaphor does not work for German history, because the time after 1945 is two antagonistic states with two antagonistic narratives. Before 1945, there's genocide, destruction, and dark horror. And even the Weimar Republic might be good for cinematic thrillers, but not so much as a political a model. So if Germans look back to the history, they logically come at a certain point, whatever your interpretation is, to the Kaiserreich. And I think the way how the Kaiserreich, if it is interpreted in the next, let's say, 20 years, more positively or more negatively, or more ambivalently, and what kind of history is going to be made out of the Kaiser William II, the last Kaiser, who was by all means an extremely interesting animal and a very interesting man. I think this is an open question. And I don't think that my book or any book which is written now is going to put the nail into this coffin. I think this coffin is still open. I think one thing which cannot be undone, and it's not only my book, but it is the, if you will, the common work of, let's say, 10 or 20 historians who have been working on these questions in the last 5 years. What cannot be undone is the fact that this man and larger parts of his family were looking for a collaboration with the Nazis and actually acted in a collaboration with the Nazis, though this played out against them in the end. And though their hopes and dreams did really not fulfill. And also we could add this also, they are not the main responsible people, neither for the Third Reich nor for the crimes of the Third Reich, but they are an important element in the making of the Third Reich and in bringing the German conservative elites closer to the Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to leave some of these questions open. As you say, there are going to be future historians working on this, but it is a really, really fascinating topic because it isn't just about this particular, issue of collaboration, but has much wider implications, not just the legal ones either, but really in general how we see this period of German history today and kind of how we place it in the narrative strand of German national history overall. So I find this endlessly fascinating and could have chatted to you for another hour about this, but I'm not sure my listeners' patience will stretch quite that far. So let's end it here. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me and my Zeitgeisters.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
And if you, dear listeners, like to read or hear more from me, consider subscribing to my Substack Zeitgeist for some weekly Germanness in your inbox. So long and auf Wiederhören.